For the last 100 years, all that we've ever meant by talking about a system change has been what we've called capitalism versus socialism or communism. And by that we seem to have meant, at least according to what most people said or wrote, that instead of private enterprises, the government would run the enterprises. And instead of the market being how we distributed goods and resources, planners would do it. A planned economy versus a market economy, a public enterprise economy versus a private enterprise economy. That's the way the debate has been run. When the Russian Revolution happened, the Soviets took industry from the private owners and made them state enterprises. And they submerged the market. I mean, they used it, but they subordinated the market to planning. They did what the socialist and communist and Marxist movements had said they should. And the Chinese did that, and Castro in Cuba did that, and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam did that, and the Eastern Europeans did that, more or less. We have to face the fact it didn't work. That doesn't mean that there weren't enormous advances made in those societies. There were, lots of them. They were able to provide services to their people that capitalist countries still can't match. They were able to provide opportunity. But in terms of fundamentally changing the society, no, they couldn't do that. They couldn't even survive. They couldn't even perpetuate what they had created. The Soviet Union imploded on itself. The Chinese are in a process of transition that looks more and more like what it is everybody says it looks like. And the others are all accommodating, one way or another. Vietnam, Cuba, and so forth. Some more, some less. So something was missing. The something is, I think, the transformation of the enterprise. Whatever socialism and communism meant, it tended to be about who owned stuff and how things were distributed, by plan or by market. What was not transformed was the actual life of the workplace, the place you spend most of your time as an adult. 5 out of 7 days, 9 to 5, you're at work. And you're shaped fundamentally in what kind of a person you are, what kind of a spouse you are, what kind of a parent you are, what kind of a citizen you are, above all by this place where you spend so much of your time trying to be creative, using your brains and muscles intensively to do things. How you shape that workplace has to be a crucial part of how you build the society you want. Capitalism always does it in a fundamentally unjust and undemocratic way. There is no polite way to say otherwise. Most business in capitalist societies is done by corporations. The fundamental reality is that a corporation has a tiny group of people at the top. We call them major shareholders. Those are the folks who have the big blocks of shares that give them effective control. Those shares elect the board of directors. That's how you get on the board of directors. The people with the shares elect you to that job. That's the only way to get there. Board of directors has 15 to 20 people. The major shareholders, another 15 to 20 people. So we're talking 30 to 40 people run the corporation. They decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. The rest of the people who work there, the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, Walmart has 1 million or 2. They all live with the results of those decisions, but they are excluded from them. That is the opposite of democracy. Democracy is if the people who have to live with a decision are guaranteed the right to participate in it. A democratic institution would be run the same way a democratic community is run, or a democratic election is run. That's when everybody who's impacted by anything is a participant in deciding what happens in that anything. If that applies to your community, if that applies to the ward you live in a town, if it applies to the school board participation you have as a parent of a child, then you want to explain to me how this country, which committed to democracy, managed throughout its history to never engage the question, if democracy is so good, why do we exclude it from the place we spend most of our adult lives? Hello, something wrong here. But I'm not interested in it because it's democratic. I like democracy, I'm in favor of it. But that's a little bit like saying, you know, you like apple pie and mommy and warm winter nights. Not too exciting. So why am I interested in democratizing the enterprise? Because it will change our economic and therefore our political and cultural lives. If the workers make the decisions in a factory or an office, you think they're going to close down and move to China? You think? You think? Come on. These are not complicated ideas. They're not. They're not. If the company wants to install a technology that really wrecks your lungs because it pollutes the air, because it makes them an extra 3% profit, and the board, which is sitting 1,000 miles away, decides, oh, we need the extra profit, and so we're going to have this technology, and you're all free to leave the job if you don't want to breathe the air. But if the workers who have to breathe it, whose children have to breathe it, whose spouses have to breathe it, whose neighbors have to breathe it, you think they're going to make the decision with the same ease to install a dangerous technology? I don't think so. Here's another one, big one. In December, Obama gave a speech in which he said he was very concerned about the growing gap between rich and poor, or words to that effect. And I take it from the polls that Americans these days are quite aware of the growing inequality and pretty much against it by overwhelming majorities. Well, here's a simple rule of economics. The single most important factor creating the gap between rich and poor is how we as an economy distribute the profits of enterprise. That extra that a company makes over and above what it pays its workers, the profit, the net revenue, the surplus, whatever you want to call it, how that gets distributed determines the relationship between rich and poor. We're not rich and poor because some of us get a higher wage than others. We're rich and poor because some of us get a higher, lower wage, and we get a cut of the profits. How do you get a cut of the profits? By owning shares of stock or by being on the board of directors or a top manager. So here's how it works. Capitalists and corporations make profits. Who decides how the profits are distributed? Well, the same people who decide everything else in a corporation. The major shareholders and the board of directors. And here comes something that will really surprise you if you're 3 years old. They give it to themselves. They pay it out in dividends to the shareholders, and they pay it out in huge salaries to the top managers who also sit on the board of directors. Hello? How surprising is that? You want the distribution to be equal, or at least less unequal. The solution is not what we do in the United States, fight with each other about how do we redistribute income. How do we have a tax system which goes to the rich people and says, I'm going to take some back. Stop. This is ass backwards, to use a technical term. If you don't want inequality, don't distribute it unequally in the first place. Then you won't have the problem of redistribution. You won't have bad feelings among people as they fight and think, you're taking my money. Yeah, but you shouldn't have gotten it in the first place. If the people democratically distributed the profits, and what profits are we talking about? The profits that every worker in an enterprise contributes to, right? The secretary, and the guy who sweeps the floor, and the technical whiz kid, and the purchasing manager, they all do their part. You know how I know that? Because every corporation says that to its employees 4 or 5 times a week in really obnoxious ways. So I know it must be true. But if everybody helps participate in producing the profits, how exactly do you justify a tiny group of people deciding what to do with the profits everybody else produced and distributing it to themselves in huge amounts while everybody else can go screw themselves? You want to have a less unequal distribution of wealth in the country? Change the organization of enterprises. Because if you don't, you're not serious. You're not going to solve the problem by redistributing. We've been doing that in this country and in other countries for 200 years. It doesn't work. Even when for a time you can have a progressive income tax, which takes more from the rich than it does from the poor, guess what? You've given an enormous incentive to the rich to figure out a way to get around it, which they always do. You want to keep doing this absurd game? Stop. If redistribution isn't successful, then don't distribute it unequally in the first place. And the way to make sure that happens is to have a democratic process of deciding how to distribute the profits that everybody helps to produce. It's democratic, it's less unequal, it will keep industries and jobs here, and it will be a serious blow against environmental degradation because it really sets the mass of people against the damage to the environment that they will pay for. These are major gains, really earth-shaking, economic system-changing gains that could be made from a serious conversation about creating in the United States a vast sector of worker co-ops, democratically organized enterprises that could coexist with capitalist enterprises on a level playing field so that all Americans could have some freedom of choice. All Americans could decide whether you want to work in a top-down hierarchical capitalist enterprise or a worker co-op. You would have the choice. You don't have that choice now. When you buy something, you could buy a product that comes from a capitalist enterprise or one that comes from a worker co-op. You know why? Because we'd have a law. And the law would say that what the little label on the back of the shirt has to just not only tell you what country it comes from, I mean, how interesting is that? It would have to tell you what kind of workplace does this come from? A co-op or a capitalist enterprise? And you could begin to buy the kind of object that comes from the kind of production relationships you want to support. You'd have the freedom to express your views on alternative organizations of production. Any country seriously calling itself democratic would have to make that a subject to democratic debate and election. Here's a way to do that. And we have all the precedents. Small businesses in America used to complain that they had no way to compete against big businesses. The big businesses could get credit cheaper. The big businesses could muscle around and get the best inputs. So the small businesses got together and they got the government to create, many, many years ago, something called the Small Business Administration, the SBA, whose job it is to give little businesses all kinds of preferences big businesses don't qualify for. The SBA goes, I hope I'm not telling you anything you didn't know. The SBA goes around the United States giving cheap loans to little businesses, giving them technical assistance, making sure that government orders go to them so they don't just go to the big businesses. We even have minority business administrations to help minorities have a chance. Well, good. What we need, obviously, is a co-op business administration whose job it would be to create a co-op business sector so we could all learn what it's like and Americans could decide how to choose between what they prefer between a capitalist enterprise and a co-op enterprise. I'm eager for the competition because I'm real confident how that's going to work out.